He was shot on set by a gun that was never supposed to kill. The camera was rolling. The lights were hot. Crew members stood exactly where they'd stood 100 times before, trusting routine the way film sets always do. Then a sharp crack split the air, and for one breathless moment, everyone treated it like sound design. Brandon Lee staggered. Somebody laughed nervously. Somebody said, "Cut." And then the laughter died, because the blood was real. Nearby, a monitor replayed the take as if the footage could explain what no one could. It was the 31st of March 1993. They were filming The Crow, a story about a man who refuses to stay dead, an undead lover pulled back into the world by grief and revenge. But this wasn't a scene. This was a 28-year-old actor collapsing under studio lights, while people sprinted toward him with hands that suddenly didn't know where to go. At first, the mind searches for the simplest explanation. A malfunction, a freak accident, the kind of impossible headline you read once and never forget. A prop gun, blank ammunition, safe. Words that sound comforting until they aren't. Because on that set, safety became a rumor, and a single moment turned an unfinished performance into a permanent legend. Only after the sirens, only after the hospital, only after the silence settled did the world snap the bigger label onto the tragedy. Bruce Lee's son is dead. And that's when the story stopped being just about a shooting. It became about inheritance, about expectation, about a young man trying to step out of a myth only to be trapped inside one forever. Was this just a tragic accident, or the final act of a legacy he never escaped? And if he had lived, would we still be talking about him today? When Bruce Lee died in 1973, the world lost a phenomenon. Brandon Lee lost a father. He was 8 years old. That difference matters. To the public, Bruce Lee was invincible, an icon of discipline, speed, and philosophical clarity. To Brandon, he was the man who picked him up, who trained with him, who set expectations without ever needing to speak them aloud. And then, suddenly, he was gone. What remains when your father becomes a myth before you have even finished being a child? In the years that followed, Brandon grew up in a house filled with absence. His mother, Linda Lee Cadwell, worked to preserve Bruce's legacy, publishing books and guarding his philosophy from distortion. Everywhere Brandon turned, there were photographs, interviews, documentaries, his father's face frozen in eternal youth. The world mourned a legend. Brandon learned to live beside a ghost. He was raised between cultures, American and Chinese, yet belonged fully to neither in the public eye. To some, he was not Asian enough. To others, he was not American enough. Identity, for him, was never simple. It was layered, observed, and constantly compared. Every move he made seemed to echo someone else's footsteps. As a teenager, that pressure erupted. He got into fights. He challenged authority. He carried a temper that those close to him described as less arrogance and more unresolved grief. Anger is often the loudest form of confusion. How do you compete with perfection? How do you grow into yourself when the world already decided what you should become? He trained in martial arts, of course. How could he not? But even that came with scrutiny. If he was good, it was because he was Bruce Lee's son. If he stumbled, it was because he could never be Bruce Lee. There was no neutral ground. Yet beneath the defiance, there was thoughtfulness. Friends later recalled that Brandon was introspective, sometimes surprisingly quiet, sometimes sharply funny in a way that cut through tension. He understood the mythology around his father. He respected it, but he did not want to be preserved inside it. The paradox followed him everywhere, pride and resistance in equal measure. He admired Bruce's philosophy, discipline, fluidity, self-knowledge, but admiration can become a cage if it defines you before you define yourself. How do you build your own identity when the world only sees your father's face? For Brandon, the answer was not rejection, it was redirection. He began to shift his focus toward acting, not just physical performance, not just martial choreography, but character. He enrolled in acting classes, he studied technique, he read, he listened. He sought something that could not be measured in punches or kicks. Was he honoring Bruce Lee? Or trying to outrun him? Perhaps both. Because stepping into film was not simply a career move. It was a declaration. I am not an extension. I am not a sequel. I am not a living memorial. But Hollywood has a long memory and an even longer appetite for recognizable names. Brandon would soon discover that escaping a legend is harder than carrying one. And the closer he moved toward building his own path, the more clearly the industry saw the brand attached to him. Before he ever held the role that would define his short life, he was already fighting a quieter battle, the fight to be seen as a man, not a legacy. And that battle was only beginning. By the time Brandon Lee committed to acting seriously, he understood something most young performers never have to confront. Talent alone would not define him. His last name would walk into every audition before he did. He trained in New York and Los Angeles, studying craft the traditional way, scene work, voice control, emotional memory. He wasn't interested in coasting on martial arts choreography. He read Shakespeare. He analyzed characters. He wanted interiority, not just impact. Those who worked with him during this period often described him as focused, almost obsessive about improvement. He was not trying to be Bruce Lee on camera. He was trying to disappear into roles. And yet, every casting room carried an unspoken tension. Producers saw box office potential attached to the Lee name. Executives saw marketing leverage. The industry loves legacy, but it also packages it. Brandon sensed this. He knew that if he leaned too heavily into martial arts, critics would dismiss him as a copy. If he avoided it completely, audiences would question why he was denying the obvious inheritance. Was Hollywood giving him a real chance, or just selling his last name? His early films reflected that tug-of-war. In Showdown in Little Tokyo, he played alongside established action talent, proving he could handle physical intensity on screen. The film was pulpy, stylized, not prestige cinema, but it demonstrated presence. He was not awkward. He was not derivative. He carried himself with a different rhythm than his father, less explosive, more controlled. Then came Rapid Fire. This was closer to a leading man test. Brandon performed his own stunts, delivered sharp dialogue, and showed flashes of charisma that critics began to notice. Reviews were mixed about the film itself, but many acknowledged that he had screen magnetism. There was something in his eyes' intensity without imitation. Still, he remained in a difficult middle ground, too associated with martial arts to be considered purely dramatic, too committed to acting craft to be dismissed as a stunt performer. He was carving space, inch by inch, not leaping into stardom. If he had not been a Lee, would he have been cast at all? That question lingered around him, sometimes voiced openly, sometimes whispered behind industry doors. It created a strange paradox. His name opened opportunities and complicated them at the same time. Success would always be measured against a legend. Failure would be magnified as proof that legends cannot be inherited. Off-camera, those close to him describe a man far removed from the brooding persona audiences would later project onto him. He had a dry, dark sense of humor. He could be playful, sarcastic, unexpectedly self-aware, but he also carried a depth that made him seem older than 20-something Hollywood peers. Perhaps that depth came from loss, perhaps from constant comparison, perhaps from knowing that he had no room for mediocrity. He was determined to prove that he was more than a brand extension. What he wanted was not just fame, it was authorship, control, the ability to choose roles that explored vulnerability, contradiction, moral conflict. He did not want to be reduced to slow-motion kicks and poster-ready poses. He wanted complexity. The irony is that the very industry he hoped would validate his individuality was also the machine most capable of simplifying him. Hollywood does not always reward nuance, it rewards narrative. And Brandon's narrative was already written in bold letters, son of a legend. But narratives can be rewritten sometimes by one defining role, and that role was about to arrive. When Brandon Lee accepted the role of Eric Draven in The Crow, it did not feel like another action assignment. It felt like transformation. The film was dark, stylized, almost operatic in its grief. Based on a graphic novel born from personal tragedy, The Crow told the story of a musician murdered alongside the woman he loved only to return from the dead and avenge her. It was not a martial arts showcase. It was a story about loss, rage, devotion, and unfinished love. For Brandon, that difference mattered. He immersed himself in the character's emotional landscape. Eric Draven was not invincible. He was wounded, haunted, romantic in a way that bordered on tragic poetry. The role allowed Brandon to explore something he had been searching for, vulnerability layered beneath strength. Was this the part that would finally separate him from his father's shadow? On set, those who worked with him described a focus that bordered on intensity. He was leaner, quieter, deeply internal. Between takes, he could still joke, still flash, that dry humor friends recognized. But once the camera rolled, something shifted. His physicality became controlled, almost balletic. His eyes carried a kind of stillness that felt older than 28. Eric Draven was a man who had died and returned. Brandon was an actor trying to be reborn. The timing was uncanny. Alternative culture was rising. Music had grown darker, more introspective. Audiences were drawn to anti-heroes and wounded men. The Crow arrived at exactly the cultural moment when its aesthetic black leather, white face paint, smudged eyes felt less like fantasy and more like a generational mood. Did he choose the role? Or did the role choose him? It was the first time critics began speaking of him not primarily as Bruce Lee's son, but as a performer with his own aura. The footage captured during production revealed a presence that was magnetic without being loud. He did not dominate scenes through aggression. He held them through stillness. Yet the production itself was not smooth. Budget constraints tightened schedules, weather-complicated shooting, the atmosphere carried strain. Independent films often operate on the edge of chaos, and The Crow was no exception. Crew members pushed through long days, trusting that discipline and routine would carry them to completion. But discipline cannot compensate for every oversight. On the 31st of March 1993, during the filming of a scene in which Eric Draven is shot, a prop gun was used standard procedure in countless productions. Unbeknownst to the crew, a fragment from a previously mishandled dummy round had lodged inside the barrel. When a blank cartridge was fired, the force propelled the fragment forward like a live projectile. In seconds, fiction collapsed into reality. How does a prop gun become a real weapon? In the chaos that followed, there was no myth-only panic, only disbelief, only the desperate hope that what had just happened could be undone. Brandon was rushed to the hospital. Surgery followed. Hours passed. He did not survive. Was it negligence? Or a chain of small mistakes no one stopped in time? The tragedy would soon invite speculation, whispers of curses, conspiracies, dark coincidence. But in that immediate moment, none of that existed. There was only a film halted mid-production and a young actor whose performance would forever be incomplete. Yet even in incompletion, something irreversible had occurred. The footage already shot carried a new gravity. The story about a man who returns from death now existed alongside the memory of an actor who never would. And in that uneasy overlap between art and reality, the legend began to take shape. In the weeks after Brandon Lee's death, the question most people asked was simple: how could this happen? Film sets are built on repetition, protocol, layers of assumed safety. A prop gun is not supposed to become lethal. Blank ammunition is not supposed to behave like a live round. And yet, in Wilmington, North Carolina, during the production of The Crow, those assumptions collapsed. But to understand the accident, you have to understand the environment. The Crow was not a lavish studio production. It operated under financial strain. Budget constraints tightened schedules. Days ran long. Corners, small ones, procedural ones became easier to overlook. Independent productions often walk a thin line between efficiency and exhaustion can dull vigilance. Crew members later described the set as intense but not reckless. There were safety meetings. There were procedures. Yet filmmaking is a chain of tasks, and a chain is only as strong as its weakest link. In this case, that weak link was technical. Earlier in production, dummy rounds cartridges assembled without gunpowder had been prepared improperly. A fragment from one of those rounds became lodged in the barrel of a revolver. The obstruction went unnoticed. Later, When a blank cartridge was fired for a scene, the explosive force propelled that fragment forward with lethal velocity. It was not conspiracy, it was physics. How does a prop gun become a real weapon? The answer is disturbingly mundane, inattention layered over assumption. After the shot was fired, confusion reigned. Some crew members initially believed Brandon was acting. The scene required him to react to gunfire. But within seconds, the illusion broke. Blood was visible. Panic replaced procedure. He was transported to the hospital. Surgeons attempted to repair catastrophic internal damage. He died hours later. In the aftermath, investigators examined the production's safety practices. The official conclusion identified negligence in handling and inspecting firearms. There was no evidence of sabotage, no proof of intentional harm. But there was accountability. Lawsuits followed. A settlement was reached with Brandon's family, including his mother, Linda Lee Cadwell. Was it negligence or a chain of small mistakes no one stopped in time? That question lingered in public discourse, amplified by grief. And then came something else, myth. The press resurrected the idea of the Lee curse. Bruce Lee had died in 1973 under circumstances that also sparked speculation. Now, 20 years later, his son had died during a film. The symmetry was too cinematic to ignore. Headlines leaned into the narrative. Coincidence began to look like destiny. But tragedy does not require the supernatural. It requires vulnerability. Still, myth spreads faster than nuance. Conspiracy theories circulated. Whispers suggested sabotage. Others framed the death as eerie fate, a young man playing a character who returns from the dead, only to die himself. The overlap between fiction and reality fueled something larger than facts. Did fate intervene? Or did media reshape the tragedy into something more dramatic than it was? The production of The Crow eventually resumed. Through script adjustments, body doubles, and early digital compositing techniques, the film was completed. It was a decision some questioned. Was finishing the movie an act of tribute or of commerce? When the film was released in 1994, audiences did not watch it neutrally. Every scene carried the weight of what had happened. Brandon's performance was no longer just performance. It was preserved memory. In that preservation, something shifted. The accident ended a life, but it also froze an image young, intense, unaged by time. And once time stops for someone, the story changes. Because unfinished lives invite imagination, and imagination is the birthplace of legend. Before the headlines, before the lawsuits, before the mythology, there was a wedding. Brandon Lee was engaged to Eliza Hutton. They had met through work, built a relationship away from cameras, and were planning a future that did not revolve around legacy or legend. Invitations had been printed, the date was set, the church was reserved. There were conversations about where they would live, how they would balance careers, what kind of life they would build outside the shadow of Bruce Lee's name. In private, Brandon spoke about stability, about wanting something normal. For a man who had grown up inside mythology, normality was not small, it was radical. What would his life have looked like just weeks later standing at an altar instead of lying under studio lights? Eliza later described the days after the accident as a blur of disbelief. The person she had planned to marry became a global headline overnight. Grief does not move at the speed of media. While the world debated safety protocols and whispered about curses, she mourned a fiancé. A future collapsed not in decades, but in seconds. This layer of the story often gets overshadowed by spectacle, yet it is the most human part. Brandon was not only an actor on the brink of career reinvention, he was a partner, preparing to take vows. The narrative of rising stardom tends to eclipse domestic details, but those details are what make loss feel real. Did fate intervene, or did carelessness steal that future? After his death, Brandon was laid to rest beside his father at Lakeview Cemetery in Seattle. 2 graves, 2 generations, 2 lives ended before their trajectories could fully unfold. Visitors still leave flowers, letters, tokens. Some come for Bruce Lee, the global icon. Others come for Brandon, the son whose story feels unfinished. In death, their narratives became permanently linked. But here is the complexity. While Bruce Lee's legend was forged through a completed body of work and philosophical impact, Brandon's legend rests partly on absence. He did not have decades to evolve. He did not have failures that softened into reinventions. He did not have the chance to age on screen. He was frozen at 28. And when someone is frozen in youth, perception becomes selective. The audience remembers intensity, potential, mystery. They do not witness compromise or creative missteps. They imagine upward arcs uninterrupted by reality. Are we mourning the man or the potential? This is not cynicism. It is human psychology. We are drawn to unfinished stories because they allow us to participate. We project the career he might have had, the awards he might have won, the genres he might have conquered. In that projection, we preserve him in perfection. Brandon Lee's wedding never happened. His future never arrived. His adulthood never matured beyond promise. Instead, he became part of a lineage defined by brilliance and abrupt endings. And perhaps that is why the story endures. Not only because he died, but because he died at the precise moment when everything seemed about to begin. After the funeral, after the legal settlements, after production resumed, something else began to move quieter, more powerful than any investigation. The myth. Hollywood has always known how to turn tragedy into narrative, not out of cruelty alone, but because storytelling is its native language. And Brandon Lee's death arrived wrapped in symbolism too striking to ignore. The son of a global icon dies young, just as his career seems ready to ascend while portraying a man who returns from the grave. It felt scripted. Did Hollywood create the Brandon Lee legend the moment he died? When The Crow was released in 1994, audiences did not approach it as a simple gothic thriller. They arrived carrying knowledge. They watched every frame aware that the man on screen would never age beyond 28. The film became more than cinema, it became memorial. Box office numbers reflected that emotional weight. Critics noted the performance with a tone that bordered on elegy. Reviews did not merely analyze acting choices, they mourned. The distinction matters. When criticism turns into tribute, evaluation shifts. And so Brandon Lee entered a specific category of cultural memory, the unfinished icon. He was placed beside James Dean and River Phoenix actors whose careers were interrupted at the edge of possibility. In each case, death sealed youth in amber. Imperfections never had time to accumulate. Reinventions never had time to dilute mystique. Are we remembering the man or the potential? Media narratives leaned heavily into coincidence. The idea of the Lee curse resurfaced in headlines, even without evidence. 20 years separated the deaths of Bruce and Brandon, yet the symmetry proved irresistible. Coincidence was reframed as fate, pattern replaced probability. But myth does not require supernatural belief. It requires emotional resonance. The Crow's aesthetic, black leather, smeared eye makeup, romantic violence became embedded in alternative culture. Fans dressed as Eric Draven. Quotes from the film circulated like poetry. For some, the character was inseparable from the actor. Brandon was no longer simply portraying grief. He embodied it in public memory. This is how myth functions. It simplifies. It distills complexity into image. In reality, Brandon's career had just begun to stabilize. He had successes and criticisms. He was evolving, not perfected. But evolution requires time, and time was denied to him. In its absence, imagination rushed in. What might he have become at 35? At 40, would he have transitioned into dramatic roles, produced films, directed, or would he have faced the same volatility that challenges many young actors once early momentum fades? These questions cannot be answered, which makes them powerful, because uncertainty invites projection. The industry also faced uncomfortable reflection. Safety protocols were re-examined. Firearm handling procedures tightened. The accident forced a reckoning, quiet, procedural, but real. Yet even these structural changes were often overshadowed by the romantic narrative of a cursed lineage. In the end, two parallel truths coexist. Brandon Lee died because of a preventable production failure, and Brandon Lee became immortal because of the story built around that failure. Immortality is not always earned solely through achievement. Sometimes it is forged through interruption, and interruption freezes possibility in its most luminous state. Brandon Lee never reached the stage of life where myth begins to soften and reality takes over. He never aged into the kind of complexity that only time can carve into a performer. He never stumbled publicly, recalibrated, and returned stronger. He never experienced the gradual transformation that turns raw intensity into mature artistry. For him, time stopped at 28, suspended between breakthrough and becoming. That suspension is not just tragic, it is powerful, because it freezes a person at the precise moment when promise feels limitless. When someone dies young, memory becomes selective. We are left with an image untouched by long-term disappointment. There are no late career misfires, no creative detours, no reinventions that blur the original spark. What remains is potential bright, unresolved, and permanent. It invites projection. It invites imagination. Would Brandon Lee have become a lasting cinematic force, evolving beyond the gothic intensity of The Crow? Or did his death preserve him at the exact moment when his future seemed infinite? That question lingers precisely because it cannot be answered. We also cannot separate the man from the interruption. His final performance is inseparable from what happened on that set in March 1993. The grief surrounding the film shaped its reception, and the reception shaped his legend. Yet, beneath the headlines, beneath the whispered narrative of curses and coincidence, there was simply a young actor trying to define himself beyond his father's name. The son of Bruce Lee did not want to exist as an echo or a sequel. He wanted authorship over his own story. Instead, he became a symbol. Two graves rest side by side in Seattle, one belonging to a completed legend, the other to a story that never had the chance to finish writing itself. And perhaps that is why we still speak about Brandon Lee today, not only because he died, but because we will never know who he might have become.